AIDS Day. How are we feeling about it? What does it mean to us? Anyone want to?
World AIDS Day. Yeah, it's I hold place for reflection and acknowledging the loss that we've had. Of so many beautiful people, and sometimes we forget that it's possible that an entire generation could have been gone. If we didn't get all of the very good medicines that we have that keep people, living with HIV, keeps the virus suppressed. So World AIDS Day is kind of that time to remember those people who we've lost to HIV, but also remember all of the people who've contributed to the fight towards eliminating transmissions and, getting us all of this advanced medication and technology. But again, also to remember the people who've stood fearlessly, alongside people living with HIV, and have just, it's not bothered them, they've not been living with HIV, but they've chosen to still be part of the movement. Remembering all of those people and, remembering all of their achievements.
Mm-hmm. It feels like when it's an issue that most people won't think about HIV on a day-to-day basis, it won't have touched their lives. And they won't understand that kind of what's going on under the surface for people who have been affected by it. But World AIDS Day it's maybe a chance. It's a time where it's in the spotlight. It's a chance where people can talk about it, where people who wouldn't otherwise think about it do, and that kind of remembrance aspect feels really important. But also, I suppose, an opportunity to talk about how far we've come, and also where we can. But what else needs to happen as well? It's got to stay to stay relevant. It's got to be something that motivates continued action, continued change, continued progress, I suppose.
Yeah, it definitely does. I think last year when we went to the Scottish Parliament for the World AIDS Day debate, it was great to see it being talked about, but it also was quite shocking because some of the language being used by MSPs, some of them just said AIDS and were saying words that we don't use anymore. And I think it was quite conflicting because it was that one hand, it was great to see it on the agenda and to see them talking about remembrance and talking about ending stigma and new transmissions. But on the other hand, like they themselves actually were saying some things that were maybe incorrect or maybe were slightly stigmatizing. And it's tricky when they obviously aren't intentionally doing it. And it's the same with people who, if you're doing a stall on the street and people will ask questions that are maybe quite inappropriate or stigmatizing, and it comes from a kind of, not a place of harm or of intentional discrimination, but it is so ingrained. And it's trying to overcome that, I think, is quite tricky.
But that's really good. I think in so many discussions as well, like one of the problems is people use, because language evolves around a whole range of issues, people will use words and they'll maybe use the wrong language. I think if we don't shout people down for using the wrong language, but it's an opportunity to kind of say that language is language that would have been used previously, and here's why we don't use it, here's the impact that it has on people. I think the thing around World AIDS Day is that kind of sense that it's probably the most publicly recognisable kind of aspect of what we do. If people who know nothing about HIV will have heard of World AIDS Day, and there's something quite counterintuitive about us using the term AIDS even. Like it's not a term that gets used even in like a medical context anymore. We talk more about late stage HIV, and it's kind of it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It's a spotlight, but it's maybe a spotlight that still maybe is slightly focused in the wrong direction.
Definitely.
And I think that's for me that's one of the drivers of stigma, in terms of like if we're looking at World AIDS Day, we're looking at HIV, we're looking at stigma and all that. It's stigma can exhibit from a lack of understanding about a certain thing, and in a world where we have so many words flying around and so many words that could mean so many different things to different people, it's when do we take a step back from the word and look at the actual, like what's the actual issue here. So for the stigma around, just like you're saying, the stigma that can sometimes even come out of a moment in time when we are consciously trying to, challenge the stigma around HIV. What do we think should be happening, to just change the opinions that people might sometimes have about HIV, about AIDS, about people living with HIV? What can we do is kind of like the big question.
It's one of these things that so much of the stigma it's not really even about HIV as a condition, or a lot of the unmeant stuff is about confusion about HIV, like remembering what it was like pre antiretroviral treatment, about the kind of prognosis of living with HIV in the late 80s and early 90s and all these sorts of things. That's all kind of, that's the kind of stigma about HIV specifically, but so much of the stigma we now see is just around, it's more around discrimination of the populations who are disproportionately affected
definitely.
by it. It's about making judgments about people who are living with HIV, saying, well, the reason they have it is because of this or that, and kind of placing blame on people, which just isn't is clearly wrong. How you change that is a real challenge. It's a kind of, it's not something that there's a quick fix for. It's a mix of education, of kind of leadership as well, like in terms of decision makers using the right language, in terms of backing up warm words. So for the World AIDS Day debates, you'll have members from all parties who want the same things we want. They wouldn't find a reason to disagree with anything that we want to see change. There's a real warm sentiment there. It's about how you then translate that and create the urgency and say that this needs to be a priority. Supporting people living with HIV and working to reduce new transmissions with the ultimate goal of ending transmissions is something that we need to work towards, and it needs people to do more than just say warm words. Exactly. It's about turning that into action as well.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the and I can't remember who said this. Oh no, I think I was watching a movie and the person had just lost a loved one, and the person said, "I don't need your sympathy, I don't need your tears." And I was just thinking about that in relation to like HIV, because obviously when you tell someone I'm living with HIV, more often than not, the first thing they say is, "Oh God, I'm so sorry," or "You're so strong," and I'm like, there's times when I'm like, I get it, I understand where you're coming from. There's just times when I'm like, back off, like. Well, firstly, I don't care that much, so I don't care what you care. So it's like, it's not really about that. It's about the fact that, like you've said, when you see the stigma around HIV, it's sometimes not about the HIV itself. It's about the people living with it and the populations most affected. And when we look at the populations most affected, they tend to be people or population groups who are experiencing inequalities on a broader spectrum. And so what we are doing in essence is we've created a system of society where certain people are sort of adversely impacted by everything we do, whether that be around healthcare, social housing, and things like that, and immigration, all of that stuff. We've created that system, but then what that means is anytime there is a medical condition such as HIV, it then affects those communities more because they're already facing this level of, I guess, a ceiling level. Yeah. And then what we do is then blame them for having the condition in the first place. So it's like we've created the conditions for them to suffer from anything that could come into, our lives. But then we also blame them for having it. So it's like, are we seeing this cyclical nature that it's not really about HIV in most people's eyes? It's about how they perceive certain communities. It's about how they perceive certain people, and about how they perceive, I guess, these people's lives. So if we're looking at addressing why people's lives are affected in certain ways, if we look at addressing some of the inequalities that people are facing, all of it, we're not rewriting the HIV story, we're rewriting the entire landscape. And I feel like we should start working with other people who are interested in just making a better life for everyone and try and address some of these problems rather than solely focused on, I work in the HIV sector, let me try and do this just within HIV. It's not really about the one medical condition. It's like there will be something else that would come up once we eliminate population groups, and we'll probably have a World Something Day about that particular thing. So it's less about that, more about making sure we don't get there in the first place again.
Exactly, because the stigma towards HIV is never about HIV itself. Most people who perpetuate stigma don't know anything about HIV, really. It's always rooted in homophobia, racism, discrimination, and thinking about, the most vulnerable people in society, and the way that there's a certain disgust towards them sometimes, and And that is what it comes down to, and you're so right. It's such a wider issue that relates to social inequality, and other issues have such a knock-on effect. I mean, for example, for us in Scotland, obviously there's the huge issue of drug use and intravenous drug use, and it's brilliant to see that policies like safe consumption rooms are being piloted, because we know that in our work that will make such a difference. But you even see the way that drug users are talked about and called all sorts of horrible things, and then HIV is often associated with that, and it's just this cycle, what you mentioned, and it's never ever about HIV itself, because I guarantee you, if you ask, the average person about HIV, they won't know anything. They won't even know what it stands for. They won't know what it does. They won't know what it means.
Yeah.
So yeah.
When you're working with service users as well, you're having conversations with them. You're creating that space where they can talk, maybe for the first time, openly, and feel safe to say whatever it is that's on their mind, and to know that they're gonna, whatever they say, they're not going to be judged. They're not going to be turned away. And what you quickly come across, and coming back to what you were saying, I say that kind of idea that the problems are so much broader than a condition. The problems are whether it's discrimination, whether it's poverty, whether it is substance use, whether it is around identity and sexuality. The kind of total life experience of these people has led them to the point where they may have found themselves at more risk of HIV, or more at risk of poor sexual health or poor mental health. And what I find is, like, you reach a point where the lines begin to blur between causes, and you reach a point where you say, I can support, part of the support I can offer you is pointing you in the right direction of support around some of the other issues that you're experiencing as well. And you suddenly begin to see this opportunity to really work across, and I think the third sector is really well placed for that, in terms of working across different organisations.
Yeah.
HIV doesn't exist in isolation, and you can't tackle it in isolation. There are communities that we work with that if you went in talking about HIV, you wouldn't get very far. They wouldn't want to hear it because of the stigma that surrounds it. There are ones where there is high literacy around it, but we're still seeing the impact of HIV, because we still need to address the inequalities that underpin it. Until you address those inequalities, it's a real challenge. So
yeah, and I feel like that's where we should be going with World AIDS Day, because I think, if we get the one time of year where we have this platform to scream about what we do and the people we work with and the people we're trying to work with, in terms of, people who might be living with HIV who do not know about their status, or people, going through some uncomfortable experiences but do not know they can come to organizations like Waverley Care for support. If we have that platform once a year to scream about it, and we are just screaming about the surface level stuff, I always say to people, it's nice to talk about problems. Problems, it draws people together. It makes you feel warm. It makes you feel seen. Again, it's like, but like, what does that actually mean? What does that do? It's like, if we have this platform and we're just talking about the surface level stuff, and we're addressing the things on the periphery, I guess, it's fun and it's good. It feels nice. But the moment we go past that day, everyone is just going to forget everything again.
Yeah.
And then we'll come back and do it next year. And we'll come back and do it next year. But if we use that platform to talk about these deeper issues, these root cause issues, we stand the chance of getting the attention of people who could actually do something about some of these issues. Or dare I say, we stand the opportunity to actually find some of the answers to the problems. Because if you don't mull something over in your head, it's almost impossible to come up with the solution. People don't just have a random, problem solving sort of train of thoughts out of the blue. You've got to be thinking about the problem for that to happen. So if we don't use that platform to do it, if we're just like, let's come together and let's mark this thing and move on and then do it again next year, we'll just keep, because I feel like we should come to a place where, and this is what I think, I feel like we should come to a place where a sexual health charity should not be needed anymore, and a mental health charity should not be needed anymore, and a cancer charity should not be needed anymore, because it's so ingrained in how we live our lives as people to disregard negative opinions about any one thing. but to also create a society where all of these things are just seen as, if you happen to be living with such condition, this is what is there to support you to live well, without having to worry about how will people view me, how will my family view me, how will the law view me. You know, all of those things, we should be able to eliminate all of that and kind of come back to a society where everyone just lives knowing that could happen, but if it does happen, like it doesn't change anything about like who you are or what you should be able to look forward to in your future. So in a way, like I feel like we should be working towards that end. As much as it scares us as an organization, we should be working towards our end. We should be working towards, and not just our end in terms of eliminating new transmissions, because in my opinion, let's face it, eliminating new transmissions is not the only problem we have. So it's like, and I was saying this earlier, when we eliminate new transmissions, we're giving people the opinion that after that there is nothing else that needs to be done.
Exactly,
so we lose funding sources, we lose support, we lose the public's opinions, and I guess buying to what we do.
And if you're not careful about how you phrase that,
Exactly.
the language of elimination can itself become stigmatizing. You have to make clear that part of that drive to continue to reduce transmissions and to get to zero transmissions is about saying that only happens when people living with HIV are able to live as themselves without discrimination, that they're able to access services without having to think twice about should I tell them this because I've had a bad experience in the past. That we need to get to the point where people feel accepted and that HIV is just another long-term condition like many others that don't have that kind of, that don't have the baggage that comes with it. That if we can get to that point, then we create the condition that says to people, HIV isn't something to fear, and looking after your sexual health is something that we should all just be doing normally. It's not something that we need to, it's not something you need to be embarrassed or shy about. It's something that we all do as responsible citizens. It's, but you have to make sure that people living with HIV are part of that conversation, and that improving and that making sure that living with HIV is not a barrier to living a healthy, happy life.
Yeah, and in that regard, it's like what should we be? Because people living with HIV obviously already face some sort of issues within the spectrum of just like, there's so many issues basically that people could experience on their journey living with HIV, but it's like they already face some of these barriers. So at what point do we, again, this is something that's very, very, very provocational, but like at what point do we leave people alone to live their lives and do the work we're employed to do? Because I'm all for lived experience. I'm all for putting people living with a condition at the heart of what we do. But I'm also all for, if you get paid to do a job, do your job. And you should, like, we should build a framework in which I should be sufficient enough to advocate for people living with HIV who I work with. Not because I'm living with HIV, but because I am paid to do the job, to gather the information that's needed to influence decision making without having to put someone with the lived condition on a stage and say, it's World AIDS Day, talk about your experience.
It's about drawing that line between the idea of putting one person and making their experience so central and saying this is you're creating this kind of false idea that there is one way to live with HIV, and that one person's experience is symbolic of everybody's, and that's unfair. I think like the approaches of services have to be informed by those people's lived experiences. They have to be they have to be built on an understanding of the challenges that service users face, and then that gives and that lends credibility. I think from the point of view of like getting coverage and getting the word out there, I think for people who have no engagement in the story, I think hearing someone's story is very powerful and more interesting than frankly hearing the three of us talking
I agree with
talking
that.
about it.
I agree with that.
But I suppose you've got to strike the right balance. It's not just
it's about balance.
It's about balance, and I always tell people a story is not only a story because the person who went through it told it. We all listen to stories today that we don't even know whose story that is, but it's like like has never told me his story, and I will still get moved by the story about Zeus if he ever was real. But you get my point. Like, it doesn't always have to be the person who lived the experience to convey the story. A story is as powerful if it's told the right way, and I feel like that is where we should be. Again, another thing we should be focusing on World AIDS Day. It's giving a global perspective about both a virus as well as how it impacts on people's lives without having to inconvenience so many people who are already, again, dealing with some of the very, very challenging things that come with just being cogs in a machine that no one even understands how it works. You know, people are dealing with so many things, and we should be influenced by their experiences and what they're going through. And if someone, for any reason, chooses to come forward to say, I want to, add my voice to that collective of what you're already doing, all well and good. But we should try and not make World AIDS Day another opportunity for policymakers, decision makers, funders to be like, oh yeah, bring someone with a lived experience and we'll fund you if we hear that story.
Yeah.
We should tell them, no, you should be able to fund us based on the fact that we've provided evidence of what we say. And you should be able to trust that. And if you don't, again, it goes back to temporary inconvenience for long-term gain. If you don't, take your money elsewhere. You will come back in a few years' time, because when you do realize that no one else is giving you that preferential treatment, you realize maybe we should just do what we want to do because it's what we should be doing, rather than because we've had some emotional string pulled that will be pulled by someone else or something else in the next few weeks.
It's really interesting listening to that, because it's that it feels quite counterintuitive, actually. Like it feels like you want to hear those stories. I suppose the thing is, you want to get to a place where it's completely uncontroversial for someone to come forward and tell their story.
Yeah.
The fact is, it's so difficult for people to come forward just now, and that's why the work is needed.
Yeah.
Because people aren't free to just do that, to tell their story, and it comes with this kind of this weight of almost being of speaking for. It's ludicrous to suggest that someone stands up and says, "I'm speaking for every person," because we're all individuals and we all have our own experiences, and that's as true for people living with HIV as anybody else, and everyone comes at it from their own perspective.
Yeah.
So,
I think a lot of it comes back to what would people's lives be like if Waverley Care wasn't there a lot of the time. I think for things like funding, no one knows our services better than us, and no one knows the support that we give. I mean, you're giving support to people directly, and you can see visibly the changes that you're making on people's lives. And I think for World AIDS Day, not to like pat ourselves on the back too much, but we know better than anyone how important the support and the care is, and to support people to tell their stories is so important. But you're right, it's about balance. It's about making sure that we're not. It's also about making sure that we're compensating people for their time if they're wanting to tell their story about something that could be very traumatic and very hard to talk about for them. And I think us being able to use our networks and our platforms to let people tell their story is great. But you're right, it's not about the individuals. It's about the overall why we're here and what we do.
I completely, and stories should be most important to the person telling them than whoever is listening. Because one of the things that happens to us, especially when you experience something that could trigger experiences of trauma, is you experience that in isolation. So a story is a way to put context into one experience. And the storyteller is the most beneficial recipient of that, the story, than whoever is listening. And so again, going back to World AIDS Day, I feel like this should be another opportunity for us to do that, to remind, whoever we're speaking to, that we don't always have to put someone up here with lived experience to make you remember why it is important to remember, what's happened on the journey of HIV for 40 years, or where we're trying to go, and why we need you to play your part. It should always, it should always be, we should be thinking about the longer term rather than the short term, because it's good, if we do this one thing to achieve this one goal, but in the longer term, are we actually just biting ourselves in the behind? And are we actually doing a detriment to some of the people we work with? So it's striking that balance and using World AIDS Day just to remember, first of all, what's happened from where we started to where we are now, where we need to go, but also each person's responsibility, you know, whether as individuals or as an organization or as governments or, you know, and that responsibility, you know, sometimes is as easy as saying, you've done a good job, but please do better and be better.
Do more.
And even tell ourselves that sometimes. Because we can get stuck as a charity in this whole notion that we do good, which we do, but sometimes we can forget that, you know, we have immense power and resources that if we choose to hold back on, so many people's lives will be affected. But we choose not to, not out of, because we think we're the best people on the planet, but because of the people we're working with and because of the lives that, you know, we constantly interact with on a day-to-day basis. Take away Waverley Care, and I can conveniently and boldly say to anyone's disappointment and disapproval that the NHS will suffer greatly when it comes to sexual health service provision. Take away Waverley Care, take away another organisation like THT, and let's see the National Health Service try and cope with sexual health service provision within Scotland.
Yeah.
So we have that power. We just choose not to take it away because we understand it's not about us. And it's not about you or them, or it's about everyone, making sure we all live as best lives as we can. So yeah, I think for me, World AIDS Day gets to that point where I become very angry, but also become very...
I simply say thank you very much.
Yeah?
Yes.
Yay.
Thank you.